Hey everyone, welcome back. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff on Canadian firearms laws this time around.
Yeah, looks like we're diving deep into non-restricted firearms today.
Definitely. This document you sent lays it all out in pretty clear language too, which is awesome.
It's great that you're taking the time to understand these regulations.
For sure.
Whether you're a seasoned hunter or just starting out, knowing the law is absolutely crucial for responsible firearm ownership in Canada.
Absolutely. And we'll unpack it all right here, right now.
And speaking of resources, BC Firearms Academy is a really excellent place to start if you're new to the firearms community in Canada.
Awesome.
They can really help you with everything from licensing to safety courses. It's a great resource.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. One thing that stuck out to me in this document was the section on transporting non-restricted firearms.
Okay.
It's not as simple as just tossing your gun in the back seat, right?
Oh, definitely not. The regulations are very specific, even if you're just driving between hunting spots. The key point here is that your firearm must be unloaded at all times during transport.
Unloaded firearm, check. What about muzzle loaders?
Ah, yes, good point. If you're transporting a muzzleloader, you've also got to remove the flint or firing cap. Think of it as an extra layer of safety. It ensures there's absolutely no chance of an accidental discharge, even if you hit a bump in the road.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's say I have to stop for gas or coffee or something. What's the deal with leaving your firearm unattended in your vehicle?
Another good question. So ideally, you should store the firearm in your vehicle's trunk or a similar lockable compartment.
No.
But if your car doesn't have a trunk, the rules state that the firearm needs to be out of sight and the vehicle must be locked.
Out of sight locked. Got it. Now, what about remote wilderness areas? I feel like there were some different rules there.
You're absolutely right. The regulations do change a bit when you're in more remote areas.
Okay.
If your vehicle doesn't have a trunk, you'll need to secure your firearm using a locking device, something like a trigger lock or a cable lock.
Right.
Unless, of course, you need the firearm readily accessible for predator control, which is a specific exception that they outline in the document.
Interesting. So venturing into the backcountry means being extra mindful of these specific rules.
Absolutely. And it highlights how these regulations are tailored to different scenarios,
Yeah.
to ensure safety in different contexts.
For sure. Okay, so we've covered transporting non-restricted firearms in quite a bit of detail. What about storing them at home? There are rules for that too, right?
You bet. The document outlines two main methods for safely storing your non-restricted firearm at home.
Cool.
The first option is to render the firearm inoperable.
Okay, so that could involve something like using a trigger lock.
Exactly, or removing the bolt. Anything that physically prevents the firearm from being fired. The second option is to store the firearm in a sturdy, secure container or room that can't be easily broken into.
Okay, so make it unusable or lock it away securely. Those are the two main approaches. What about ammunition? Does that have to be locked up separately?
That's a crucial point. The general rule is that ammunition must be stored separately from your firearm unless it's also stored in a secure, locked container. So you can keep them together, but both the firearm and the ammunition need to be locked up.
Gotcha. Safety first, always. But I recall seeing something about exceptions to these storage rules, specifically for situations like predator control or when you're in those remote wilderness areas we talked about earlier.
You're right. In those very specific situations where you might need quick access to your firearm for predator control, the regulations allow you to keep the unloaded firearm readily accessible. However, even in these cases, the ammunition must be stored separately.
Okay, so unloaded firearm, handy for predator control, but ammo locked away separately. What about in a remote wilderness area where we know the rules are a bit different?
In a remote wilderness area, you're permitted to have both your unloaded, non-restricted firearm and ammunition readily accessible.
Interesting. So the law recognizes those unique circumstances and allows for a bit more flexibility. But I imagine there are still some best practices to keep in mind, even if the rules are a bit looser.
Absolutely. Just because the law permits something in specific situations doesn't mean you should throw caution to the wind.
Right.
Responsible firearm ownership goes beyond just following the letter of the law. It's about always prioritizing safety and handling your firearm with the utmost care, regardless of where you are or what the situation is.
That's a great point. It's like, having a driver's license. You pass the test, but that doesn't mean you can just forget about being a responsible driver.
Exactly. It all comes down to recognizing the potential power of firearms and acting accordingly.
Now, before we move on, it's important to remember that everything we've discussed so far applies specifically to individuals. If you're a business owner, there's a whole other set of regulations you need to be aware of.
That's right. And it's not just federal regulations either. Remember, provincial or territorial laws and even municipal bylaws can come into play, adding another layer of rules to the mix.
So many layers. It sounds complex, but it all boils down to promoting safe and responsible firearm ownership across the board.
Exactly. It's about ensuring a consistent standard of safety and responsibility no matter where you are in Canada.
So listeners, do your homework. Make sure you're aware of all the federal, provincial, or territorial and municipal regulations that apply to you in your specific area.
Knowing the law is the foundation of responsible firearm ownership. And speaking of foundations, we should mention that BC Firearms Academy is a fantastic resource for anyone looking to enter the firearms community in Canada.
Great point. They offer a wealth of knowledge and support from licensing to safety training.
Absolutely. It's always wise to expand your knowledge and hone your skills when it comes to firearms.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground on transporting and storing non-restricted firearms. Before we wrap up this section, let's quickly recap the key points we've discussed so far.
Sounds good. Let's recap what we've learned about transporting those non-restricted firearms.
Okay, so starting with the basics.
Your firearm must be unloaded whenever you're transporting it,
Right.
whether you're driving to your hunting spot or heading to the range.
Makes sense.
And if you happen to have a muzzle loader,
Yeah.
you need to go that extra step and remove the flint or firing cap.
It's all about minimizing the risk, right?
Exactly.
And then, of course, we talked about what to do if you need to leave your vehicle unattended. The ideal scenario is storing your firearm in the trunk.
Or another secure lockable compartment.
Right.
But if you don't have a trunk, then it's all about making sure the firearm is out of sight and the vehicle is locked.
Off-site locked.
And as we discussed, those rules become even more specific when you're in those remote wilderness areas.
Which makes sense, considering the unique challenges and considerations in those environments.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've covered transporting those non-restricted firearms. What about storing them safely at home?
Remember, there are two main options outlined in the document you provided.
Let's walk through them.
The first option is to render the firearm inoperable.
So this is something like using a trigger lock.
Precisely, or removing the bolt. The key is to physically prevent the firearm from being fired.
So essentially make it unusable.
Right.
The second option is to store the firearm in a secure container or a room that can't be easily broken into.
Exactly.
So option 1, make it unusable. Option 2, lock it up tight.
And of course, we can't forget about ammunition.
That's right. Ammunition needs to be stored responsibly as well.
The general rule is that ammunition must be stored separately from your firearm.
Unless it's also stored in a secure locked container.
That's an important detail.
So you can keep them together, but they both need to be locked up.
Exactly.
And then we talked about those specific exceptions for predator control in remote wilderness areas.
Right.
In those unique situations, you might be permitted to have your unloaded firearm and even ammunition more readily accessible. But even then, as we discussed, it's crucial to remember that responsibility and caution are paramount.
Absolutely.
Just because the law might allow for some flexibility in those specific circumstances doesn't mean you can disregard safe handling practices.
It's about understanding the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it comes down to respecting the potential power of firearms and acting accordingly.
Couldn't agree more.
And before we move on, it's worth reiterating that everything we've talked about so far applies to individuals.
Businesses have their own set of regulations they need to follow.
And it's not just federal regulations either.
No.
Don't forget about those provincial or territorial laws and even those municipal bylaws that can come into play.
Right. It might seem like a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
But it's all designed to ensure safety and responsible firearm ownership across the country.
Exactly.
So listeners, do your research and make sure you're fully aware of the specific rules in your area.
Definitely.
Knowing the law is the foundation of responsible firearm ownership.
And speaking of foundations, for those new to firearms in Canada or those looking for a reliable resource, BC Firearms Academy is a fantastic place to start.
They offer a wealth of information and support. Everything from licensing to safety courses.
So check them out if you're looking to enter the world of firearms ownership or just want to brush up on your knowledge.
Always a good idea.
Okay, so we've tackled transporting, we've talked about storing, and we've touched on the importance of knowing the specific laws in your area.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that might seem a little unexpected in the context of firearms. Design.
Design.
Yes, design.
I'm intrigued.
I came across this fascinating article about the aesthetics of guns.
Interesting.
And it really got me thinking about how the design of a firearm can influence perceptions and maybe even behaviors.
I never really thought about it that way.
Me neither until I read this article. It argues that some firearms are designed to look sleek and futuristic.
Almost like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Exactly, and the article suggests that this kind of design can actually make the firearm seem less threatening.
Huh. Less like a weapon and more like some high-tech gadget.
Right.
But doesn't that raise some concerns about desensitization? If a firearm doesn't look like a traditional weapon, does that make people less aware of its inherent danger?
That's a valid point. The article explores that idea in depth.
Interesting.
And it goes even further, suggesting that some design elements are specifically intended to appeal to certain demographics.
Okay.
For instance, there's a whole discussion about firearms marketed towards women, with designs incorporating pink or other traditionally feminine colors.
It's definitely a controversial tactic.
Yeah, the article questions whether this is just clever marketing or if it's actually contributing to a more casual attitude towards firearms, downplaying the serious responsibility involved.
That's a good question.
And it ties back to everything we've been talking about today. The importance of safe handling, knowing the law, and recognizing that owning a firearm is a serious commitment.
Absolutely. The design of a firearm might influence our initial impressions, but it shouldn't overshadow the fundamental principles of responsible ownership.
Exactly.
So we've covered transporting those firearms, storing them safely, and even explore the unexpected world of firearm design.
It's been a fascinating journey.
And it just goes to show that there's always more to learn and consider when it comes to firearms.
Always.
All right, before we wrap up this deep dive, let's touch on one final crucial point.
Let's do it.
Remember, everything we've discussed today is based on federal regulations and the specific document you provided.
It's crucial to remember that provincial or territorial laws and even municipal bylaws can add another layer of regulations.
So before you head out to the range or the hunting grounds,
Do your research.
make sure you're fully aware of all the rules that apply to you in your specific location.
Knowing the law is the foundation of responsible firearm ownership.
And speaking of foundations, don't forget that BC Firearms Academy is an amazing resource for anyone looking to enter the firearms community in Canada.
They offer a wealth of knowledge and support, from licensing to safety training and beyond.
So if you're new to this world, or even if you just want a refresher, definitely check them out.
It's always a good idea to expand your knowledge and hone your skills when it comes to firearms.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive into non-restricted firearms in Canada. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
Remember, responsible firearm ownership is an ongoing journey of education and awareness.
Stay safe out there and happy shooting. It really is. And it's about more than just knowing those specific rules and regulations.
Yeah, it's about understanding the reasoning behind those rules. The underlying principles of safety and responsibility that inform every aspect of firearm ownership.
Absolutely right. It's about recognizing that owning a firearm isn't a right, it's a privilege.
Yeah, a privilege that comes with significant responsibility.
Exactly. And those responsibilities go beyond just knowing the law.
They extend to practicing safe handling techniques, storing your firearms securely, and always being mindful of the well-being of yourself and others.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And if you ever find yourself unsure about anything related to firearms or the regulations surrounding them, there are resources available to help.
Absolutely. BC Firearms Academy is a fantastic resource for anyone looking for guidance or information.
Absolutely. Whether you're new to firearms or have years of experience, they can provide valuable support and education.
It's always a good idea to stay informed and keep your knowledge up to date.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway is that responsible firearm ownership in Canada is a multifaceted commitment.
Yeah, it's about understanding the law, practicing safe handling, and being constantly aware of the potential impact of your actions.
It's about respecting the power of firearms and ensuring they're used safely and responsibly.
And it's about recognizing that this commitment is ongoing, a continuous journey of education and awareness.
Well said. Folks, we hope you found this exploration of non-restricted firearms in Canada informative and insightful. Remember, stay safe out there and happy exploring.